Visual novels are no real video games. Let's tackle this statement. First of all, what makes a visual novel is the focus on text-based narrative. What in other games is presented in cutscenes, in visual novels you get text boxes and still pictures. Most of them are stripped of gameplay, though you will also find some hybrid games combining a bit of gameplay with heavy focus on the written narrative, so-called adventure games. Boring, you say. Pure, I say. The magic of visual novels is that you can solely focus on the narrative. No distracting gameplay, no stressful action combat, no grinding, pure storytelling, pure reading, pure listening, pure watching. In contrast to a movie or even manga or anime, what I would compare a visual novel to, visual novels actually are less explicit in their representation. You rarely see what is happening. Thus, they can be considered theatrical games, without clear and realistic representations. But the players have to fill the gaps with their imagination, much like a novel. But at least you get some more visual stimulation. Hence, visual novel. It's a less passive activity than watching, as you have to actively engage with the material, but maybe not as active as having to slay all the monsters yourself. And here the discussion of ludology versus narratology comes into play. In their extreme forms, narratology focuses on the storytelling part of a game and aims to apply the same scientific terms as in analyzing novels or other non-video game storytelling. Ludology argues that you cannot apply usual narrative concepts, but rather should the game solely be understood by its mechanics. And considering that the first video games like Pong or Pac-Man were solely based on mechanics, the ludologist's approach seems plausible. But with the emergence of story-driven games, the ludologist's approach needs to be challenged. The first visual novel-esque adventure game was 1983, the Portopia serial murder case, developed by Chunsoft, a Japanese game where you had to solve puzzles by typing the correct words, following a non-linear story with multiple endings and surprising twists. Already sounds familiar, does it? Around the same time, first erotic adventure games entered the market, like Koei's Nightlife 1982, which was followed by many others, partly pornographic, partly actually story-driven eroge erotic games. I guess that is where the prejudice comes from that visual novels are all erotic dating sims, because that's how the genre started out. Nothing pure about that, no judgment. Though there also were smaller titles like Tokimeki High School, no, not Tokimeki Memorial, Tokimeki High School in 1987 or Noriko in 1988, representing milder forms of early visual novel adventure game dating sims. Also, 1983, the first point-and-click adventure released, which also featured a lot of animations in contrast to the other games, which mainly have static backgrounds, and voice acting quite groundbreaking at that time. Though the 1988 released Snatcher was probably the climax of the evolution from adventure games to visual novels, featuring even more cutscenes and a deep sci-fi narrative. Until then, visual novels weren't their own genre yet, but games with a mixture of storytelling and mostly light gameplay were called adventure games. Yet rooted in one of the first adventure games, the Portopia serial murder case, 1990, the first adventure game without gameplay was published, and thus the game Mirrors marks the first official entry of the genre visual novels. It's purely driven by a non-linear narrative with multiple endings. And again, it was Chunsoft. Yes, who are today known as Spike Chunsoft and famous for the Danganronpa series, for example, or the Zero Escape series, who jumped on the bandwagon and developed multiple visual novels in the 90s, at that point calling them sound novels as they, well, added sound to the until now often silent adventure games. And after 1995, with Tokimeki Memorial, more dating games entered the market, emphasizing pure love and light-hearted narrative in order to appeal to a broader market which was crowned with commercial success. So far we had adventure games, point-and-click adventure games, eroge erotic games, sound novels, and bishoujo games, male-oriented dating games. And not to forget what I talked about in my last video, the history of otome games starting 1994 with Angelique. There are so many more subgenres of what we call visual novels today, like the nakige, games which are supposed to make you cry or feel depressed. Yes, famously established by the studio Key, with their adult games Air and Canon, and the more approachable and even more famous Clannad. Having come this far, it's clear what differentiates visual novels from other games is the focus on the storytelling and almost complete lack of gameplay, depending on the game, leaving not much for the ludologists to analyze. And what I take away from this little analysis of the history of visual novels is that you choose to play a visual novel if you want to experience an interesting or even deep story. Obviously, there's nothing else but story. What might be the charm of visual novels for one is the curse of them for others, as if you don't like the story, there's nothing to fall back on. Nevertheless, this concept dominated the video game market quite a bit in the 1990s. One reason being until then there hadn't been story-driven games, and this new approach to video games pushed the boundaries and changed how players thought about video games. They now were more than Pong and Tetris, more than chess or mindless fun. They became mindful and surprising stories. Not only did visual novels push the boundaries of perception of video games, they also pushed the boundaries of the 90s consoles when it comes to graphic and storage. They were the 4K games of the 90s. The CGs and backgrounds and characters with emotions were the ray tracing and the keyboard input the VR from 30 years ago. Though dating game VR approaches today weren't that successful, I think. So no wonder they became less popular as the hardware became more capable, and first-person shooters like Doom showed they could even combine storytelling and action-packed gameplay. Now, still backgrounds and standing sprites became from being mind-blowing to boring. Players moved on to other games who, on top of the narrative and gameplay, also embraced the new 3D graphic trend, which couldn't be successfully implemented in visual novels, as the flop of Tokimemo 3 seemingly shows. The adventure game genre in general got a small revival with old games being localized for the Nintendo DS, like the now immensely famous Ace Attorney series, Professor Layton, and the Zero Escape series by oh hello, I believe we know each other, Chinsoft! All combining visual novel elements with little gameplay and puzzles, staying relatively true to the roots of the genre. That's the positive way to phrase it. The more negative way would be, how could you not come up with any innovations in the past 20 years and let the genre die like a cute stray cat you picked up but then became too much work as Christmas brought other new shiny toys? I'm sorry, but after the 2000s, the genre started to wither, as it literally brought nothing new anymore, and what used to push the boundaries of video game storytelling or hardware capacities was now considered substandard. The only games which continued to be successful, even after the masses had abandoned the genre, were visual novels with a female target audience, like the Nancy Drew series and, oh look who got here, Otome games! And that's why I want to connect some dots to my video about the history of Otome games. Remember that Otome games were supposed to bring female players into video games, as until then there were no such games specifically targeted towards a female audience. Until owners of Nintendo consoles were almost 50% female, visitors of arcades and players of older games were only 20% female, with Pac-Man being the first exception. And as women seem to be especially interested in games with puzzle elements, farming sims, atmospheric games, or interactive dramas, aka adventure games and visual novels scratched the female gaming itch. That means visual novels were the first genre to appeal to a female audience to that extent. In the video about history of Otome games, I wondered what the decline of the genre caused. And I think in combination with the history of visual novels and the help of clever and thoughtful people in the Discord, we might have found an answer. Around 2010, the genre of visual novels declined because of the reasons I already mentioned, the lack of innovation and the emergence of technically more demanding and appealing games. Thus, the market for visual novels was marginalized, and producing them became too expensive. So, many developers decided to rather make a light novel, meaning a book. Yes, these things with actual pages and stuff you engage with in a process called reading, instead of visual novel games to save production costs. It was also around 2010 that female players became more active as gamers, as more games appealed to them, thus leading to 50% of Nintendo DS owners being female, and the majority of Nintendo players being female as well. And I think games like Animal Crossing or Harvest Moon, now also getting a female protagonist, made it easier for girls to get into gaming. Similarly, the game Candy Crush, released 2012, has the largest female player base with almost 80%. Thus, now girls had a choice of appealing games. They didn't have to play visual novels anymore, but now can choose from a wide variety of games, which are gender neutral like many Nintendo games, or seem to have a special appeal to women like other puzzle or farming games. That means the decline of the genre visual novel was caused by the emerging of new, more engaging gameplay games and the decline of otome games, as women now have other games to play as well, and younger players prefer mobile experiences. Which brings us back to the ludology and narratology debate. This little history seems to show that video games should focus on ludology, as the most successful video games are gameplay games. And even among adventure games and visual novels, those with gameplay elements seem to be more popular. So the answer to the crisis seems to be that the purity of visual novels, meaning pure stories stripped of gameplay, won't lead to success. This purity needs to be corrupted with gameplay to make it appealing for a wider audience. I say corrupted because I personally prefer the pure visual novel style, but I am first in the minority with this opinion, and second, as visual novels developed from adventure games and they influence each other, it's hard to say that the gameplay mixture is a corruption. It's rather back to the roots, and more hybrid games could be what the genre actually needs. On one hand, games like Detroit Become Human or Life is Strange are new takes on the adventure genre with gameplay but mostly story-driven and choice-dependent. And the success of these games also demonstrates that there's demand for story-heavy games. You just have to mix them up a little. Likewise, hybrid games with visual novel elements don't stop games from being successful, like the Persona or Yakuza series. Also, typical adventure games like the Danganronpa series are still successful in themselves, or 13 Sentinels. Or the huge success of pure visual novels like the Doki Doki Literature Club. On the other hand, the fleeting success of visual novels might reveal something pretty interesting about video games and their players. Why do we want to play? And though the majority of my viewers doesn't mind moral problems, which is kind of a given, as I love discussing moral implications or anything meta when it comes to the games I play, so I expect my viewers to be interested in it as well, most people probably like to play for relaxation, and philosophical fulfillment isn't even a motivation factor in the player motivations model. Okay, story is though. But it's the minority of players who play a game just and only and solely for the story. For mindless relaxation, one might prefer hack-and-slash style games instead of games where you have to read or, God forbid, even think. The fact alone that game which makes you cry or feel depressed, even is its own visual novel genre, proves that visual novel players are seeking something else. They prefer calmness, serenity, and tranquility, instead of action-packed FPS stress. They care about emotions. And interestingly enough, they don't necessarily care about their own emotions, but about others. While in most other games, the focus is to level up your character, grow stronger, faster, richer. The focus in a visual novel are the emotions of the character you play, which might or might not be you, depending on whether you self-insert, but it's definitely not all about you, but about living another person's story, another person's emotions. The protagonist smiles, you smile. The protagonist cries, you cry. The protagonist learns a lesson, you learn a lesson. That's why I think visual novels are pure. There's nothing but the story, the characters, and you. You might be confronted with yourself, your own beliefs in a visual novel. Being interactive and more prone for self-inserting, it is a more intensive experience than movies or books, and thus giving us the chance to change the way we think. Like leveling up our social skills. How I explain in this video you need to watch to understand the true power of visual novels. And who levels me up are my lovely Patreons and members, motivating me to make videos like these and discussions in the Discord, and you liking, subscribing and sharing this video.